People are joining.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Public Relations and Crisis Communications for Assisted Living Residences webinar. This is Diana Pashota, and I'll be your presenter today. We're going to wait a couple more minutes for a few more people to get on and get started at about 12:32. Well, we're beginning to reach critical mass here in terms of attendees for our webinar this afternoon, so we'll get started. Welcome everybody to the Mass ALA webinar today on Public Relations and Crisis Communications for Assisted Living Residents. I'm Diana Pashota, and I am the president of Denterlein. We are a communications consulting firm that has worked with Mass ALA for off and on more than 10 years, so we know the organization and the industry quite well. Some of you may have participated in similar webinars in the past, and I hope you find today's conversation useful. So today we're going to be looking at both proactive and crisis communications. And we're starting with positive PR, sharing your message, and then transitioning into crisis communications. And hopefully, as a result of our conversation today, you'll develop a better understanding of the interplay between positive PR and crisis planning, and how many of the same tools that you use in managing your proactive communications can also be used in a crisis. We'll also spend a little bit of time on digital communications and try to save some time for questions. We will be doing questions at the end, but please feel free to send questions along throughout the conversation today, and we'll be able to answer as many as possible. And if for some reason we don't get to one of your questions today, I can always follow up by email or phone. So in terms of proactive communication, what are our goals of a PR campaign? Why are you doing proactive communications? Three big picture areas. You're looking to build your brand and your goodwill. You're supporting your marketing efforts, your ability to attract and retain assisted living residents, to create referral source patterns, and to be a good ambassador for your brand to the community. Name recognition in the cluttered marketplace in which we live is particularly important. At the same time, building brand and goodwill is also important as a hedge against a potential crisis. If the first time anyone has ever heard the name of your assisted living residence is when something has gone wrong, that has a very significant impact on your overall brand. You also want to position yourself as a leader, strengthening your relationship between your residents and its key audiences. And who are those audiences? That can be everybody from potential employees and potential residents to other community leaders and your neighbors. Many times assisted living residences are snuggled right up against traditional residential neighborhoods, and some of the unique opportunities and challenges that come from having an apartment building geared towards seniors right in the middle of a typical residential neighborhood are things to be managed. Finally, the goal is community engagement. As part of building your brand, you do want to be in a position to engage the broader community, to anticipate challenges, and to address them whenever possible proactively. So here we're going to talk about some of the tools for proactive communications. The world has changed dramatically in the past decade, and public relations has long since moved on from having media relations be the beginning, the middle, and the end of the work that an organization does to share information with its target audiences. We have an enormous array of tools and technologies available to us that allow us to tell our story publicly. And these are the exact same tools that you will likely use in a crisis in order to share information when you need to. So it's really important for you as an organization to think about who your audiences are and how you might use these various tools to engage with them. So we'll start with your website. These days, when people are looking for information about options for themselves or for their senior parents, one of the first places they start is the internet. So making sure that your website is flexible, effectively tells the story of your residents, is dynamic and engaging, answers the most frequently asked questions about being a resident at your facility is an important first step to a proactive communications campaign. Once you have a good website that's flexible and engaging, you can really move on to building strong social media tools for engaging with your potential audiences. Many assisted living residents that we work with like Facebook as a key tool for sharing news and information. It is relatively easy to set up a Facebook page. You can expand engagement through either direct advertising on Facebook or sharing information about your Facebook feed with your larger community so that residents, their families, their friends sign up to follow you on Facebook. However, as the old saying goes, if a tree falls in the forest, is anyone around to hear it? If a Facebook page exists and nobody is following it, does it have value? In order to engage people and have people follow you on a social media site like Facebook or possibly Instagram because it's so picture friendly and young people like it a fair bit, you really need to think about your content. What kind of storytelling are you doing? What important information are you sharing? And how are you engaging people? One of the things that we like to do with Facebook pages for assisted living residences is to think about how it is that we're highlighting our staff or our residents and make the page really human and a great opportunity to share your point of view through the stories of the people who spend the most amount of time at your residence. Many of you have likely long had an internal newsletter that you use for engaging the families of your residents. And for a very long time, that newsletter has been printed out on hard copy and left at the desk for people to pick up as they come and go. And most of you have probably long ago transitioned to doing those newsletters in an e-format. And what's the great thing about an e-newsletter is that it can connect back to your website and it can use lots of dynamic content. It can use visual content, it can use infographics, it can use videos, all of which are hosted on your website, which makes your website a great repository of rich content and your newsletter a place in people's inboxes where they have access to that content. Increasingly, people are using video as part of the way in which they tell their stories. So if at one time you would take a picture of a class within your facility or your residence which had a bunch of members doing Zumba, now you can take a video and video interview one of the participants afterwards about why that class is meaningful for them, how it expands their physical health, their relationships, their emotional health. And sharing that kind of video via social media helps people understand something about you as an organization. Now, finally, media relations. The media does still matter. It's considered an independent third-party filter for your information. And when you can generate some attention via the media, people feel as though someone externally has vetted you and is saying that you are a worthwhile and credible source of news and information. And so it is important to continue to build relationships with reporters and try to engage them in showing news and other things that help tell the story of your residents. So how do we do that? So there are some public relations and storytelling opportunities that we think work particularly well for both digital media, that's your own website, social media feeds, e-newsletters with links back to either of those, and media relations. We like to start with staff achievements. At the end of the day, many people come to an assisted living residence because they need a home, but they also need help. And the staff and their ability to interact with and engage with residents is an important part of your selling proposition. So helping to humanize the staff and show their commitment to the residents is a really great message. So when staff have been with your residents for a long time, have earned a significant promotion, have started a new program, any of those things is terrific fodder for, at minimum, your digital media, and possibly also for traditional media. Innovative programs are also a great place to help tell the story of your assisted living residents. In recent years, we have learned about amazing programs on art and theater and books and physical activity at assisted living residents all across Massachusetts. As the population grows ever older, people are more and more interested in learning about ways in which seniors are living active and dynamic lives, and assisted living residents are an important part of that. And so via promoting our innovative programs with both news and feature story coverage, we can help people answer an interesting question that they have. What is my life going to be like when I'm older? How am I going to live my strongest, best, healthiest, most active life? And part of the answer to that question is programs that your residence does. Resident milestones. I think that we have all probably seen stories in the paper about a local resident who is turning 100 or a couple that has celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. If you can think about how to package the milestone achievements of your residents for the local news media, these are topics that are of interest. So for example, if your residence does a monthly birthday party, and for all of the residents who have birthdays that month, and you happen to have more than 5 over 90 residents celebrating a birthday that month, you might be able to package that into an interesting feature story for your local weekly newspaper. If you happen to have several residents turning 100, which is still a pretty big achievement, even with all of the advances in medical technology, that might be an interesting story for your regional daily newspaper or even TV. A few other topics that are good for storytelling: community engagement and other activities. What are you as a resident doing as volunteers in the community? Are you hosting events? Are you a place where local political candidates come to speak and share information or ideas? Are you a place where students and young people come to volunteer? The combination of seniors, pets, and young people can be pretty powerful stuff. So if you have some volunteers bringing pets to cuddle with the seniors, that's undoubtedly a winning proposition. Leadership positioning and trends are another venue for media engagement. Does your assisted living residence director have something that they want to say, a point of view on a particular topic that they think would make for a good op-ed piece in the local weekly paper? Is there a trend that you've noticed that more seniors are interested in common and current technology that is emerging, and people would be surprised by people getting interested in that? I think there's a couple of popular video games out right now. If you happen to, in your residence, had a senior community that was really interested in one of these online game communities, that would be an interesting trend story that the news media would likely cover. And then finally, photo ops. These are pictures that you take yourself and submit to the paper, or you have the paper come to you because you've told them in advance of an interesting thing that's happening. So for example, that joint birthday party for the 3 100-year-old people in your residence, that you're going to have a giant cake at with 100 candles on it. Supposing that that doesn't negatively interact with fire codes, of course. That might be a great opportunity for a photo op. So in terms of media relations best practices, finding the topics that will resonate is really important. So there's a funny balance, if you look at the bottom right, between persistence and annoyance. So what you want to try to do is engage reporters and their editors with stories that are most likely to be of interest with them. So you start to achieve that goal by understanding the media outlet. Read the weekly paper, read the daily paper for your region, read the or website that has lots of local news on a regular basis. Get to know what kind of news they publish, when they tend to ask for picture submissions, and what kinds of letters to the editor or op-eds that they're likely to accept. Understanding the media outlet will help you better pursue story ideas that they're actually interested in. And then when you do reach out to the media outlet, start with the story. You really do want to anchor any news and information that you're sharing with personal stories. Even if it's an event update or a calendar listing, make it relevant because you're going to make it about people. The other thing that reporters really enjoy and appreciate is when you can share data to show impact. So, for example, if over the past 10 years you've seen an increasing number of residents in your residence tackle computer skills classes. And so in year one, you had 5 people who participated, and now you have 100 people, and the kinds of things they're doing is getting increasingly more sophisticated. That's some great data that might make for a much more interesting story for a reporter. Finally, persistence, although I will couple that with saying, without being annoying, providing ongoing and thoughtful information to reporters and their editors can build relationships over time. So as long as you're not pestering the local news outlet with 3 story ideas a week, regularly reaching out with relevant ideas that might be newsworthy in a polite way can help the local news editor get to know you and your organization a little better. I often think that even if that news editor doesn't publish a lot of news about you, they have heard from you often enough that they start to feel as though they know and understand your residence and its commitment to its residents, and that will help you in the event of a crisis. So from a digital strategy perspective, we could probably do a whole separate webinar, and maybe we will if folks indicate they're interested, on creating a digital strategy for your residents. We like to start with understanding what your goals are for the digital strategy. Are you using your digital platforms, your website, your social media, etc., to be a source of news and information for people who already know you, your residents, their families, potential referral sources, etc.? If so, that's one strategy. You build your strategy around that goal, which is really designed to inform and engage. However, if you're trying to use your digital platforms to build an audience of potential future residents, in addition to engaging and informing your existing audiences, that's a slightly different strategy, which requires that you be a little bit more outward facing. From there, you choose which platforms you think are going to most effectively support your goals. As I mentioned earlier, we really like Facebook as an opportunity for sharing information for potential assisted living residents clients. And that's in no small part because the Facebook demographics skew a little bit older. It's better opportunity for both visual and narrative storytelling. You can advertise really easily and really cost effectively on Facebook. But there are some merits to Instagram and a couple of the other platforms as well. And you should explore all of them to determine which one is right for you. From there, you want to build an audience. And that can happen in 2 ways. You can reach out to your existing audience, your employees, your families, your referral sources, and ask that they follow you on your chosen social media platforms. In order to get them to do so, sometimes you have to run a contest or tie it to an event or promise such compelling content that they can't resist. If you are looking to achieve a larger audience because you're trying to support sales and marketing goals, you can also use digital advertising, which is frequently quite cost effective. And what's nice about that is that it can often be geographically targeted. Then comes the fun part, sharing content, and doing so in a somewhat regular fashion. At minimum, you want 3 to 5 pieces of content a week. Some people really like to share content daily. If you were doing Twitter, I would say you might even need to share content multiple times a day because it's such a cluttered outlet. It really depends on the platform that you've chosen to share your digital information. But no matter what the platform and how frequently you share information, the most important thing is that this information support good storytelling. People want to hear about positive things that are happening around them. I would also suggest that if you are worried about potential crisis, that sharing content on digital is a great opportunity to get ahead of some of those issues. So in a senior living residence, like an assisted living residence, you want to think about things that you're doing to support senior health and nutrition, things that you're doing to prevent falls, things that you're doing to assure that the staff is really well trained and engaged. Sharing all of those stories proactively helps inoculate you a little bit against a crisis. In other words, if something bad happens, people have an understanding that your residence is a place that has actually focused proactively on safety, on staff training, on engaging its residents. Then after you've shared some content, share some more content. And the more that content can be visual, the better. Pictures of the senior residents with appropriate release forms, of course, pictures of your staff, infographics that show the different programs and activities that you have, videos if you can do it. All of those are proven to be far more engaging on social and digital media than just content alone. Finally, listen and engage. See what commenters are focused on. See which posts get the most likes. If you would like, you can even use some of the more sophisticated listening tools that help aggregate and connect which kind of information on your digital platform and what web pages get the most engagement. And then you can gear future content towards the kinds of things that people are most interested in. So preparing for a crisis is actually not at all separate from any of the things that we've just talked about. Good crisis management starts with good public relations, because if you've been doing good ongoing public relations, your brand has a presence in the local community and people have an understanding that you are a positive contributor to the community and a great resource and asset for the seniors who live in your residence. But for a crisis itself, there are some important steps to take. So questions to ask before a crisis. Do you have a crisis management plan? Have you thought in conjunction with your senior leadership team for the residents and your owner, if you're part of a larger national organization or even a regional chain, what kinds of steps you would take in a crisis? What would your priorities be? How transparent are you willing to be? It's wonderful to think about all of those things before an actual crisis event hits and you are both in the midst of responding operationally and trying to figure out how you're going to communicate. Part of that planning process means identifying in advance what are your biggest areas for risk. And this is something that has to be done multiple times in the life of an organization. So for example, for all senior living residences, there is always a risk that a senior is going to elope, or that a senior will fall, or that there will be some unanticipated interaction between two seniors in your residence. These are all things that we can all anticipate are in the area of risk. But what if your residence has had an unusually high amount of staff turnover lately, or you've just submitted your data to the state and you realize that within the past year you've had more falls than normal? How are you addressing those areas of risk and how are you planning for them? Who are the decision makers in a crisis? If something really fast moving hits, who needs to sign off on what your communications response looks like? How is that person connected with the operational decision makers? A lot of times, good crisis response from a communications perspective means being able to share what operational steps you're taking to address the challenging issue that just occurred 5 minutes ago. Reporters and the social media world all want answers immediately, and often we can't give it to them. So knowing who the decision makers are and how quickly we can get information in a crisis is critical. What's your organizational philosophy on crisis response? Are you conservative? Are you worried about regulatory more than you're worried about bad press? Are you worried about lawsuits and family reactions more than you're worried about what happens on social media? All of these things help you determine what kind of communicator you're going to be in a crisis. I would argue that communications to all of your core stakeholders effectively in a crisis does require some level of transparency very, very quickly, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. And so having these conversations in advance can be very important to being in a good position to respond during a crisis. What are the first things you do during a crisis event? And this speaks to that interplay between crisis communications and an operational crisis response to make sure that everybody understands what their roles and responsibilities are. And then finally, What tools can you use to reach your customers and your employees? And for you, your customers are your residents and they're right on site. But oftentimes their family members are just as integral. How do you get to them quickly? How do you get to employees that are either on site or coming in for an overnight shift? Knowing in advance what your communications tools are and how you can use them in a crisis is critical. I talked a little bit before about transparency, and it's a key part of this slide here. Today's expectations in a crisis assume that an organization is going to be able to respond in a timely way, to be transparent, to share a fair amount of information, to do so in a way that's authentic, and also to be accountable for things that go wrong. I think you can't look at the nightly news and not see examples of businesses, nonprofits, and individuals who are skewered by the news media because they waited too long, they didn't share enough information, their apology, if and when it finally occurred after lots of beating, didn't seem authentic, and they weren't willing to accept responsibility for what went wrong. Now, we're not saying that in every circumstance you have to immediately issue a mea culpa before you know the full facts, or that you should share facts that are not yet totally clear to you. Both of those things are challenging for an organization in different ways. But you should think a little bit about the fact that most of your residents and their families are going to have at least some of the 4 expectations around this circle in their minds when they evaluate how you responded to a crisis. In nearly 25 years of crisis management, I have found that most audiences are willing to accept that from time to time things go wrong, even in the best run organizations. And while people will judge you on the crisis itself, they will judge you equally harshly on your response to that crisis. So being in a position to meet at least some of these communications expectations will help your crisis response be judged more fairly. So this is a pretty critical page in our crisis planning scenarios. So these are the steps that we encourage all clients to take in a crisis response, and you can take them in ways that are very expansive and very narrow. But you'll notice that we say that associations are the glue and have the big picture perspective. Not just saying that because this webinar is sponsored by MassAlla. Associations are a really great partner to individual residences in answering and addressing crisis situations. If you call your association, like MassAlla, and ask them, has any one of your other association members faced an issue like this? How have they approached it? Is the media very interested in this topic? What has happened on social media? Your association partner can give you a lot of really good information. They may also be able to be in a position to be a third-party validator and help you think about how to address public policy, community, and elected official leaders. But for you in an organization, in addition to one of the first steps being to call MassAlla and let them know when something serious has gone wrong and you think there may be media coverage, the following steps are critical. First, you want to gather the facts and assess. And what do we mean by that? Yes, there are the surface level facts, what went wrong in that moment in time. But can you also look back and understand what kinds of policies and procedures do you have in place about the topic that's at the heart of what just went wrong? What kind of training do you do with your employees? What kinds of mitigating factors were at play that caused the situation to occur or your typical response not to have happened? Understanding the big picture gives you the strongest foundation for a good response. Then from there, you want to understand who your key audiences are. Is this largely an internal issue which we need to share with residents and employees? Is it something that we want to help regulators understand? Do we think it's going to become public and generate media attention? Does it have the capacity to go viral on social media? These are all questions that are worth answering when you think about which key audiences that you want to communicate with, because some of them you may choose to communicate with proactively. From there, you want to work collaboratively with the team, because you probably will have a cross-organization team that has the right information in order to guide the communications response, to collectively determine what messages do you need to share so that people can understand both the substance of the issue and what you're doing to address it. And then from there, you want to determine how you're going to approach communications. Are you going to proactively share information with the most important audiences? Are you going to have information on hand to respond to questions? Are you going to take a wait and see approach, and what are the risks there? And so that will help you determine what are your next steps in terms of actual communications. Am I going to send an email out to all of the resident families and put a letter under the door of all of the residents? Do I need to call a staff meeting for all of my staff? If a media call comes through, am I going to give them a media statement, or am I going to give them a live spokesperson? Part of that process is really thinking about what are your reputational risks here. If this is a run-of-the-mill situation, but it's with a family member that has complained a number of times before and has previously threatened to go to the media, even though it's a reasonably run-of-the-mill situation, you have to consider it a higher risk. And then finally, the last step, although sometimes this happens very early in the process, because occasionally you'll learn of a crisis because you've heard about it from the media, is to manage any inbound media inquiries on both traditional and digital media, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. So once you know all of the facts, you want to think about what are your messages if you're going to communicate proactively. We frequently find that one of the biggest reputational risks is a lack of clear information and clear understanding about what went wrong, leading people to fill in the blanks with their own misinformation about how the issue occurred. So we frequently think that one of the core things to share when something goes wrong is what actually was it that went wrong, so that everybody starts with the same baseline expectation. From there, you want to show what you understand how to fix it and what you're doing to fix it. And some of that includes talking about the existing policies and procedures you have in place to address those kinds of issues. So let's take this out of the realm of the theoretical for a second and talk about something that all assisted living residents wind up reporting to the state and have as a common issue, and that's falls data. So if we as an organization or a single assisted living residence realize that we have had an increase in our falls data and a reporter is looking at the falls data, it would be important for us to share with them why those falls numbers have gone up, what we had in place prior to seeing the falls numbers go up that was designed to limit the risk of falls, and then show what it is that we're doing to address the situation and make it better. Sometimes that does require us to point to staff accountability and investment in change. So in a situation in which we realize that the falls data, the number of falls have gone up because of possibly a change in the physical plant. The rug was getting old and worn, and inadvertently people were tripping on it. Well, then you want to show that you've invested in new flooring and that you have worked with your staff to make sure that when they spot those kinds of problems, they inform management earlier that a new investment in flooring is needed. Sometimes you also want to share data and context. So for example, if the state has changed the way that falls data has been reported between last year and this year, and that's part of the reason why you have a bump, that would be important information to be in a position to share. And finally, we do like it when organizations can engage proactively in the process of change, not as a result of consumers being really upset or regulatory agencies making those requirements. It helps tell a story about an organization that's committed to safety and a good consumer experience for their residents. Some things we try to avoid in messaging around a crisis is victimizing the organization, that it wasn't our fault. A great example of this, which may not be as applicable to assisted living residences as some other healthcare organizations, is a data breach in which a organization was hacked and information within your billing and payment system was stolen, and or personal or health information about your residents was stolen. Sometimes there's an inclination as an organization to say, hey, we were broken into, we were the victim too. That isn't going to fly for most people. They want to hear that you as an organization accept responsibility, particularly as a home for all of these seniors who are considered not technologically adept, for protecting the data within the organization. So even if you are a victim, you have to think carefully about how you frame that message and information. There are no next steps. People tend to assume that if something has gone wrong, there's got to be a way to fix it and prevent it in the future. This is very true in the world of medical errors. When a medical error happens, studies have been shown that many of the people who have been the subject of the medical error don't necessarily want money. They want to know the organization has learned from the experience and has tried to fix it or prevent it from happening again. A company leader should never be not available for comment. Although you may not always want to have your residence executive director be the prime spokesperson, there should always be someone capable of taking responsibility and providing a real and authentic response in a crisis. And finally, and I say this with great respect for the many, many lawyers that the Denterlein team works with on complicated matters of crisis communications, we do want to try and avoid anything that sounds overly legal or as though a lawyer is trying to minimize the risk of a lawsuit. So how do you limit media risk in some complicated crisis situations? We try to identify hot button issues well in advance of something going wrong. So as we talked to before, there are issues of falls. There are anytime if you run a memory care unit and you know that you are dealing with people who have a risk of elopement, what are the hot button topics that could happen that would potentially negatively impact your reputation or your brand or generate media interest? Once we've identified those issues, we can prepare to address them should they become public, and that will allow us to limit the media risk. That also allows us to think about what are our policies, what's our training, what's our messaging around these topics. Frequently, if you have an isolated incident, but you can talk about all of the steps that you have in place to limit the risk of elopement of individuals from your memory care unit, then you're in a better position to manage the crisis. And then finally, you want to educate your internal team on what it takes to have an effective external response. Does that require a live spokesperson? How quickly do you need to be able to respond? How quickly do you need to be able to get to somebody off hours, which is always when these crises seem to happen. So a few questions that the media is always going to ask that you need to be in a position to answer. How did it happen? What impact did it have on a resident or on operations? What are you doing in response? And who's to blame? And if you are in a good position to answer all of these questions, you will be able to more effectively address the media. And why is it so important to effectively address the media? It's pretty critical in today's day and age of very quick moving viral storytelling, whether it's with a traditional news outlet who sees an opportunity to promote something strongly on social media to boost its audience of followers, or it's a citizen journalist with a blog and a well-followed Twitter feed. The media moves quickly. So if you, as the communications person within an organization or the lead responsible for communications, can answer questions quickly, you can limit the intensity and duration of the scrutiny that's placed on the organization. You also limit the risk of misinformation, which is one of the biggest downsides of the quick-moving nature of the media environment today. From a digital strategy perspective, typically most organizations try to keep their digital footprint very positive. They try not to have to address a traditional media crisis on digital media, in no small part because the number of people following traditional media outlets has declined. So you're taking your most important audience that's most invested in you, and if you're putting the story on your digital media feed, you may well be telling them about the story for the very first time. So people are understandably reluctant to manage a crisis by sharing information on their digital feeds. So as a result of that, you do want to assess your digital footprint. You want to understand whether or not it's unerringly positive, only great stories about your residents and your employees, nothing about how you prepare for and address safety issues or training or a complicated regulatory environment. If that's the case, your digital footprint may not be a great place to share information in a crisis, and you probably want to try to fix that. And then from there, you want to determine from social engagement. If something about a crisis spills into your digital feed, how do you want to address it? The current best practice is whenever possible, if someone issues a complaint or voices a concern over digital media, you try to encourage them to take that concern offline and into an interpersonal conversation as quickly as possible. But sometimes you do want to share at least some information on the social feed so that if other people see that question, complaint, or concern, they have an understanding of how you as an organization address it. What do you do if a thread has been hijacked and a Facebook comment on something very innocuous has become a place where residents' families are complaining about the quality of the food in the dining room, which is a not insignificant concern for a lot of assisted living residents. But then it gets very ugly from there in terms of people talking about, well, for the overall cost we pay, the food quality is really minimal and it's not a good value, and that starts to get at the heart of your brand. So how will you address something like that? Thinking about that in advance will allow you to move a little bit more quickly when you need to. And then when, how, and what do you share when you have no choice but to address a crisis on your digital media feeds? And typically what we try to encourage people to do, and this goes back to very early in the conversation when we talked about having a flexible website, is to provide a small amount of information on our digital feeds like Facebook or Instagram or even LinkedIn, and then drive people quickly back to the website for more information. That way you're not oversharing and further inflating the crisis by putting too much information on your social media feeds. There are, however, no hard and fast rules on digital strategy. Digital media is changing every single day, and I think we are all going to increasingly see organizations called upon to very aggressively engage in crisis management on their digital feeds. When and how to engage internally. So this is a tricky one for assisted living residences. You know, because you deal with a frail and sometimes vulnerable population at one end of the spectrum and a reasonably healthy and active population at the other end of the spectrum, it's not always clear which situation will turn into a crisis with communications risk and which situation is just part of doing business as an assisted living residence. So under the theory that you do want to be, if there is bad news to share, the person to share it so that you can show responsibility and accountability, it's worth thinking about who your internal audiences are and how you engage them. So first, how do you define your internal organization? Are you thinking employees, employees and residents, employees, residents and their families, community members nearby? Who constitutes your internal audience? And then what platforms do you use to share information with them? And are they good for sharing sensitive topics? So for example, if you have an e-newsletter that's reasonably well read, is that the kind of tool that you want to use in a crisis communication situation? What could make it more effective for crisis? That's another great topic to think about in advance. Framing the issue then becomes an important part of the conversation. You know, if we know as an organization that our falls data has started to increase, that might be a good time to think about not only what operational steps we want to take to lower the incidence of falls, but also do we want to share some proactive information about falls prevention in one of our e-newsletters or online so that we can start to educate people and frame the issues and the reasons why falls data might be increasing. And then finally, the aftermath. What happens when you're surprised? So there are some times when, despite all of the information that's available to us, something slips out into the public before we have any opportunity to do anything about it. And those are circumstances where even if we're caught flat-footed, we want to move quickly to share information, correct inaccuracies, and engage our target audiences and let them know that they can come to us for direct information. And then just as a resource for the folks on the phone, I want to let people know that if they'd like, they can go to the Denterlein website and download our crisis ebook, which gives you a little bit more information on some of the topics we've talked about here today on crisis. So in that very speedy 44 minutes, we have reduced my life's work to about 20 slides and a few quick pointers. But if folks on the phone have specific questions, I'm happy to answer them. So we'll wait a second or two. I'll also let people know that subsequent to this webinar, we'll be able to share a recording of this with the MassAlla team. And if you have signed up for this webinar, we will circulate a link to it so that you can share it with other members of your team if that would be helpful. Also, feel free, subsequent to this webinar, to check back in with the MassAlla team. We do have other webinars that we can share that are very specific to digital strategies, less so in a crisis and more so about creating a strong digital platform for your organization. So if you have anything you're interested in on digital communications, be as specific as possible in sharing that information with the MassAlla team, and we'd be happy to create a webinar on anything from creating good content to using video to advertising on digital. We can happily do that. Okay, I don't think we are seeing any questions. But if you go to the Denterlein website to download the crisis ebook, you can also find my V-card, Diana Pashota. And if you have a specific question you'd like to email to me separately, or if you'd like to reach out to the MassAlla team and ask them questions, I'm more than happy to be in touch with folks. Okay, it seems like it's I've either overwhelmed everybody on the webinar today with a lot of information, or we've answered every single question. Okay, well, with that, I think we'll say thank you to the participants for joining in today's webinar. I hope it's been a useful resource. Again, don't hesitate to email the team at MassAlla. We'd be more than happy to route back with any answers to any questions that you might have that either for technical difficulty reasons didn't come through or you thought of after we finished the presentation. Thank you again for your time, and it is a terrific organization, MassAlla, and we are always so appreciative of the opportunity to speak to its members. Thank you.